Okay, so here we go.
All
So,
right.
John, it's my understanding that you typically travel a lot during this time of year and throughout the year for with and play with people all over the country. So, what has it been like for you to have to adjust to staying at home so much?
Well, it was quite a big adjustment. I casually looked back through a few years worth of calendars, and I discovered it had been many years since I had been in Seattle for more than 3 weeks. Um, I've been on the road uh, a little over half the time for about 15 years, and it's been sort of random and interesting, because I'm a freelancer. So I'm here for 4 days, I'm gone for a week, I'm here for a week, I'm gone for 2 weeks, I'm back for 2 weeks, and then I'm gone for 3 weeks. That's been sort of the non pattern of my life. Things changed a bit after Victor, my son, was born, because I made myself just a little more expensive and a little less available. I made a few like really hard decisions about things that I didn't think I could justify doing anymore.
Mhm.
Uh, because you develop a philosophy of saying yes to everything as a young freelancer, uh,
Sure.
and to suddenly decide that you're going to be choosy, it's a very big shift. So um, I've only been on the road half the time since Victor was born, and the other part of the time I've been a stay-at-home dad. Um,
Okay.
so when all the work dried up a year ago, uh, initially it was a really big adjustment. I have lived in Seattle a long time, but I've never really explored it that much. Never really, uh, certainly never spent that much time here, and a lot of my experience of life has actually been feeling like my real life is the one on the road with musicians playing concerts, and then I kind of take a break from life when I come home. Now, again, having a kid really changes that perspective, but then um, being home full time for the foreseeable future, I also have that feeling of like, okay, this is a new phase in my life. Now it's been great to get back to spending so much time with Victor. My wife continues to work. She works mostly from home, but goes into the office a couple days a week. Victor is in kindergarten, and I have. It has been very hard doing the online kindergarten. I don't think online
Oh,
kindergarten
yeah.
makes sense, and so it has not worked out to be the sort of quasi childcare that we might have hoped for.
Right.
And so yeah, I'm as busy as I have ever been, because I am now keeping a 5-year-old occupied for uh, from the time we all wake up until um, until dinner time, at least, most days.
Now
And
the hiking
so
every day is making sense.
yeah, we go out for hikes, and we spend time around the house. I've played with Legos a great deal and read quite a lot of books, and I try sometimes to work with Victor on sort of scholastic kinds of things, and that's it's helpful on the one hand because it keeps me from thinking about all the uh, all the things that I do miss about my life. Like I have um, it living the kind of life that I do. It's been difficult for me to make friends outside of music.
Ah,
Um, it can be kind of hard to find common ground with people.
sure.
Like it's a different way of life. It's a different in certain crucial ways. I think musicians have slightly different values than a lot of other
Mm,
folks. In terms of working really hard to get into a field where you will never earn that much money. It's
right.
And particularly in Seattle, where you've got, you're surrounded by rich people who they do rich people stuff, and you find yourself talking to them at a cocktail party. It gets awkward fairly quickly because they'll ask you about your life, and when you can't sort of come up with nice rich people stuff to talk about, skiing and whatever else they do, it's you sometimes find they glaze over and become uncomfortable. So I suppose I forget where I was going with that, but I guess the point is I haven't had much of a social life here. Like, I have some
Sure.
close friends, people who I really do cherish, but we most of them do the same thing I do, and so we
Right.
can go months and months and never actually cross paths because like I'm in New York and she's in San Francisco, and then I'm in Seattle for a week, but she's in Berlin, and then she's in Seattle for a week, and it's like, so I have friends who I never get to see, and then I have the
Right.
friends who I work with who I see all the time, but none of them live in the place where I live.
Sure.
So it's
Sure.
it's been a big adjustment, but again, I've got unlimited entertainment, and
Yes, it sounds
um,
like you do.
and lots and lots to do. So
Right.
like the amount of laundry that is generated by a 5-year-old going on a hike every day, that would be enough to just that's enough to use up all the time that I would otherwise spend in rehearsal. And
Sure.
then the uh, the recovery on the weekend takes up all the time that I would otherwise be playing concerts. So my um, the net use of time is definitely roughly equivalent. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. So I'm curious, when you set about choosing composers and pieces of music for this concert that you recently
Yes.
recorded for us, was there a particular theme or mood that you wish to create? And what
There
is
was.
it? Go ahead
Yeah.
if you want to answer that first.
Well, yeah. I often have difficulty. Well, I suppose I've programmed lots of concerts. I've put together lots and lots of concert programs, and there are sort of formulas that we oftentimes use to make a concert program kind of hang together. You sort of imagine a nice evening's entertainment, and um, a piece to welcome people in, and a piece to get them excited for at the end of the first half, so that they'll go out to intermission and be talking animatedly in the foyer before it's time to come back in, and then you wallop them with something weird in the second half to make them feel a little moment of doubt and dread, and then you clobber them at the end with some barnstorming number that sends them out, that gets them on their feet as soon as it's over, and play them beautiful quiet encore so that they leave with this sense of transcendent peace. And that's kind of like, it's not a hard sort of a concert program to put together, from any stylistic period,
Sure.
from the Renaissance all the way up through contemporary music. You can do the same thing of having this kind of nice arc to a program. But I tend to think, I haven't watched lots and lots of streamed concerts during the pandemic, but I've watched a few. And one of the things that I've noticed about them is that the ones that are most successful for me are not actually the most like a typical concert that you would see in a hall.
Mhm.
In terms of entertainment value and the arc of the evening and um, how things work, I've seen some wonderful programs. There was a big long series of concerts from the Chopin Institute in Warsaw, and I found them so charming because people would just play a selection of their favorite Chopin pieces,
Right.
uh, not
Yeah.
necessarily building towards a grand finale each time.
Right.
And I found those to be so enjoyable, in a way more so than watching films of ordinary concerts.
Right.
And so one of the things that I was thinking about was Well, here I have an opportunity to play a kind of a recital that I couldn't actually probably get away with in a big hall for an audience.
Mhm.
Um, the Renaissance lute recital is a tough sell generally. People do go see them, but it's not really necessarily uh, always the most um, well. It's not really the idiom for the instrument. The Renaissance lute is not a big concert hall kind of an axe. It doesn't.
Right, right.
It tends to be it is a quieter instrument. Like I play it loud. That's something
Mhm.
I've got a reputation for. It's part of the reason I have a career. But a loudly played lute is still not a massively loud instrument.
Sure.
Um, and so the music that we often play when we go to do a big recital is very outward sort of stuff, because there's a fair amount of lute music that is kind of outward and dancey and big and um, provides plentiful opportunities for strumming and things like
Mhm.
that. But I've played a lot of Renaissance lute music, and one of the things that got me into it, one of the things that got me into the business, that got me into, it being obsessed with the instrument itself, was the ruminative, quiet, beautiful contrapuntal music that actually comprises the majority of the music written for the lute in the Renaissance.
Mhm.
The other thing is that um, I was having a really hard time personally with music. Um, for many years, I've played in ensembles and things, and played the Renaissance lute whenever I could. And all of a sudden, I had the opportunity to play the Renaissance lute by myself for no one. And uh, I thought, okay, well, I'll play my favorite stuff. And somehow, um, playing the fun, dancey, upbeat, virtuoso music that I tend to enjoy, it didn't make sense. Every day I'd get up and I'd learn that there'd been another 9/11's worth of my countrymen who had died,
Mhm.
and there would be some massive chaos in the world, and to think of all the people all over the world, um, all of the empty chairs, too, to imagine, you know, playing in a playing in a concert hall and thinking like. Well, I saw some pictures from Europe of places where concerts were happening, where they were actually spacing people out, spacing people
Right.
way out. But what I actually see in those pictures is uh, uh, some some departed soul in every one of those empty seats. And I
Right.
thought, what I remember is there weren't any performances of the 1812 overture after 9/11. You know, we heard the Adagio for strings of Barber and Nimrod from the Enigma variations and beautiful, quiet music of mourning. And, it's been talked about before that we as a nation have a real problem with mourning right now.
Mhm.
Um, we've kind of forgotten how to do it on a large scale.
Yeah.
Part of it is that we've had you know, our our war dead are no longer even acknowledged, not even slightly, and um, people dying. It's just sort of it's become something that we just kind of deal with.
Mhm.
It's a partisan issue if we should mourn the victims of gun violence, you know, like as a body, should they be considered as a demographic, or like so the our nation is, and I don't know how much this extends to other countries, but this idea of mourning and how do we do it, and what's my responsibility? Like I've had the conversation a few times that, one of the things that I have tried never to say at the beginning of a sentence in answer to a question from somebody is the phrase, as an artist, I feel like I try never to say as an artist, but I wound up unable not to say, okay, like as an artist, what do I need to do right now? What's my
Mhm.
responsibility? If I'm being given an opportunity to play something, should I try and make it normal? Should I do the normal thing? And I thought, no, I need to play only the best music that I can think of to play right now. The music that makes sense to me, the music that I can stand to play too, where I can say, okay, in every moment that I'm playing this music, I am, I feel that I'm doing what I should be.
Mhm.
I don't feel like I'm having to put on a mask of like, I'm an entertainer and I'm entertaining you now. It's like, nope, this is the music that I feel needs to be played. It's the only music that makes sense to me. And so that's how I ultimately chose this music. It was, everything that I'm playing is a Renaissance fantasy. It's all nominally abstract music. That there's not necessarily a programmatic element to any of it.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily telling a particular story, but it is deeply emotional music. Um, it's and all of it for me is intensely powerful, but it doesn't sell itself too hard.
Right.
And
Right.
so, yeah, just as I was thinking, what I should play, because I've got great big filing cabinets full of music and hard drives full of music, and I even have, I don't know, a few thousand yards of microfilms of music. Like, I mean, I've got,
Yeah.
quite a trove, but the pieces I wanted to play actually leapt out at me immediately.
Yeah. Well, it seems like you really honored your emotional journey through the music that you chose. It was in alignment in that way. And so it was it was coming from a real place of authenticity and integrity from your own experience. And
That
that's,
hope.
you know,
That
yeah,
was
yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about the composers who were featured in this program.
all right.
What were their lives like, and what do you believe motivated them to write this music?
Well, in in the case of the earliest composer on our program is Francesco da Milano, who was born outside Milan, but spent most of his career in the service of a few popes in Rome. And then the last decade or so of his life, it's unknown what he did or where he went. But then he died in 1543. Um, we don't know too much about his life. We don't know who he studied with. We don't know what he did for fun. We don't, like we know that he played the lute like a god, and that he was called Il Divino by his contemporaries, the divine one. So he was highly respected, and for me, he's a composer whose music is so perfect that it makes the details of his life um, almost irrelevant. It's kind of a straight, and which is convenient because we don't know the details of his life.
Right.
There's like uh, there's the there's another philosopher who was giving a course on Aristotle and said, um, Aristotle was born, he thought, and he died. That's it for
Wow.
biography. Now let's talk about what so that's
Uh,
Francesco for you. Now Alfonso Ferravasco was born the year Francesco died, 1543.
Mhm.
and he was born in Bologna. He was from a musical family, and he moved to England. He was in the service of Queen Elizabeth I for a good long while. While he was in England, he was quite possibly largely responsible for the importation of the Italian madrigal to England. Now, the madrigal in England really took off. You know, all of the fa la las that you've ever sung in your life. Alfonso Ferrabosco is at least partially due the credit for that. He was a friend and mentor to composers like William Byrd,
Mhm.
and he had a, you know, just sort of a sterling career as a composer at the court. He traveled back and forth, which at the time was highly unusual because, you know, England was in a state of war with all Catholic countries at the time. And it's reckoned that he might have been a spy for Queen Elizabeth
Oh,
when
wow.
he traveled back to Italy. But you know, that was actually quite common among the class of composers that was always being sort of shuttled back and forth between royal courts. It was just sort of part of the gig for quite a lot of them.
Interesting.
And yeah, but in 1580 he went home for a visit. Went home to Italy for a visit, and just never returned to England
Mhm.
after that. But his lute music is it's not known in the case of some of his pieces whether he wrote them for lute or they might have been instrumental ensemble music that was then arranged.
Mhm.
Um, he was, you know, his lute music is all difficult, I would say. It's beautiful, beautiful stuff, and it has incredible melodies and wonderful counterpoint, um, and it's oftentimes more sort of richly varied than than you'd expect it to be. But it's all a little bit awkward, and
Mhm.
that leads some folks to believe that it might originally have been um, instrumental ensemble music or something like that that was arranged possibly after his death. Because the other thing is that a lot of the sources for his lute music date from after he had left England, and the provenance of the pieces is not otherwise known. So
Mm.
it's but I've always been attracted to his music. At first, it's a I suppose when you well, I was a classical guitarist before I became a lute player. You know, you kind of,
Right.
you know, typical, right? And one of the things about being a classical guitarist is I always had this problem, which is I was raised by concert pianists, and my pianist parents, they were primarily a four hands team, and so they played great music that is unfamiliar to most people. But as pianists, you know, they also diverted themselves by playing Chopin and Brahms and Bach and Beethoven sonatas and Mozart and Schubert. And, you know, I was steeped in the great piano repertoire as a
Mhm.
kid. And
Mhm.
then I became a guitar player. And
Mm.
as a guitar player, you play arrangements of piano music, which can be very exciting, you know, wonderful stuff. You know, like the big hits for classical guitar are pretty much all arrangements of piano music.
Okay.
And then you want to play something that sounds like Mozart. You have to play something by some lesser light of the 18th century. The music is just never quite at the level. If you want to play romantic music, you can find some wonderful music for guitar, but you've got nothing at the level of Chopin or Brahms or Schumann.
Right.
And um, so when you discover as a guitarist that there is guitar music by a well-known composer like Diabelli, very exciting. You know, not as exciting as if you found, you know, original guitar music by Mozart, but still, you know, you're like, oh boy, Diabelli. And you find that, oh, well, this is extraordinarily well-crafted music, and it's nice to play something that's by a composer from the European mainstream.
Sure.
Um, Kind of the same. It happens much more often in the 20th century that there's music for the guitar by Benjamin Britten or by
Yeah.
Francis Poulenc or someone like, you find these little nuggets that are so precious. So the great lutenist composers, we love their music. These were the great instrumentalist composers of their era, people like Francesco and people like John Dowland. But
Hmm.
then you find that there's a composer, Alfonso Ferrabosco, who is a universally admired composer, a hugely influential composer. You could think of him as being like at the level of Franz Schubert or someone like that.
Sure.
He was across the board, really at the top of music in his time. And he wrote some lute music, and I thought, oh wow, that's fantastic. Ferrabosco wrote lute music. I know, his music and his stuff. So, like initially it was just that superficial name recognition, like,
Right.
oh boy, this movie has George Clooney in it, or, here's some lute music by Alfonso Ferrabosco. So initially it was just that
Hmm.
drew me to him. But then, when my former teacher made an edition of the collected lute works, my former teacher, Nigel North, and that was real convenient because, it's like, oh, hey, wow. And so I just learned all of his lute music.
Right.
And I found, oh my God, this is better than I thought it would be. This is, some of the most wonderful music I've ever played, and it feels like it's mine too.
Wow.
It's sometimes you play a piece and you just immediately feel, oh, this is exactly the piece that I was supposed to play. And so that's kind of where his music came from for me. And then the music of John Dowland, a day without Dowland is like a day without Twinkies or a woman without diamonds. You just, one simply doesn't not play Dowland. And uh, John Dowland is the composer who's closest to my heart. I think, for a lute player to say that, it's like saying, air is my favorite thing to breathe. Um,
Right.
but he's um, he's uh, he's a composer who, uh, absolutely the most wonderful lutenist who ever lived, no doubt about it. And he wrote music to suit every mood, but he was
Yeah.
especially good at sad.
Aha.
Um,
Okay.
Now, in his time, it's talked about frequently that there was kind of a cult of melancholy
Hmm.
uh, during like it's sort of something we associate with people like Shakespeare, who was born at the same time, and um, they cultivated being sad,
Hmm.
uh, well, being sad, well, doing
Brought it
sad,
to a fine art.
yeah, and in the case of Dowland, the longer I've lived with his music, the more I've kind of started to love it. Like there was never a time that I didn't, but it has deepened because um, the level of craft that his music shows at every single little gesture, um, even though it's so idiomatic to the instrument, every part of it fits under the hands in this beautiful way. Even though it's all really hard. His
Hmm.
music is just hard, but it's hard and always for a good reason.
Sure.
Uh, and so as I was, I thought, okay, I'm playing the best music that I can think of. I'm playing the very best music that I can even imagine. Uh, what are the pieces by Dowland that I find most indispensable? And I made a difficult decision, which was not to include anything in any dance rhythms, because Dowland wrote lots of fantasies and lots of songs, but a huge amount of his lute music is comprised of dances, um,
Hmm.
big dances and little dances. There are some of his uh, pavans are the biggest pieces that he wrote. Um, and some of his galliards, I'd say, they the galliard is generally a quick dance, but his development of the dance is akin to what Chopin did with the Polonaise. It's just he turned it into a gigantic and beautiful artistic forum. But as I was looking at all of the wonderful Dowland that I've ever played, I found that I couldn't play in dance rhythms now. Um,
Yeah. Right.
I, something about the way that they something about the way they carry the music
Hmm.
uh, felt like a felt like a strange sort of imposition.
Or like it
So
was
I wound
forced.
up focusing exclusively on the imitative fantasies that he wrote instead. And Dowland had a tough time in certain crucial ways. As a young man, he converted to Catholicism at a time when that was a very strange thing to be doing in England. He was in France in the service of a nobleman and converted to Catholicism. He just heard the calling for whatever reason,
Right.
and um, when he got back to England, he was, it was already clear to anybody who's paying attention that this is the best lute player in the world. But he did not get the job at the court of Queen Elizabeth I, and he petitioned for a job, and everybody sponsored him for the job. But for possibly more reasons than just his Catholicism, he was never given a job.
Hmm.
The job that you'd say this was rightfully his job.
Right.
He should have had this. He should have had this gig, but he wound up having to spend a great deal of his professional life in continental Europe, in Denmark and Germany. He traveled around a great deal. He did all of these things, but he had a family in England. He wanted to be home. He kept coming home in order to try to petition again for this job.
Right. Right.
And um, when he was finally able to get a job at the court of James the First after Queen Elizabeth died, and he never really composed or did much of anything after that. He was an extraordinarily prolific composer for a really long time, but as soon as he got the job he wanted, he just shut it all down. He he did some publishing with his son, Robert, and he put his son's name on some music even, and seems to have just enjoyed the fruits of his labor after that. And I um, I suppose that's a narrative that I find quite compelling. Like in my little way, I've spent so much time away from my own kid that uh, some element of Dowland's pathos makes sense to me in a way. But I also find that his music is for me the perfect music of mourning.
Yes.
And and uh, and again, it's simply too good not to play. It's better than it can be played. So
Right.
that's that's kind of how I came to choose the pieces on the program.
Okay. So I believe you wanted to share a little snippet of some of the music we'll hear on Sunday. But before you
Yes,
do that, would you tell our audience a little bit more about your lute?
certainly. No, this is the lute that I'll be playing. This is my 7-course Renaissance lute. Let me get a slightly better camera angle here, hopefully without dumping my computer on the floor. There we go. So this lute is miraculously more or less in tune. Um, I've had this lute for almost 20 years, and it's almost 30 years old. Um, I was its third. I am its third owner. It was made. The guy who made it played it for several years. Then he sold it to my buddy Dave, and then my buddy Dave sold it to me, and I will never sell it to anybody.
Aha.
It was so this was made just north of here in Vancouver, BC, by a guy called Ray Nurse. Now is um, Ray is to lute building what I don't know. I'm trying to think of an artist who I think is an adequate comparison. I'd say Rothko.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
just what Ray does is perfect. Um, he's he's one of the most intelligent people who you can ever meet. He knows everything about everything, and he built a great many absolutely glorious instruments. If we remember Marguerite Tindemans, who we miss very, very much, she played a viola da gamba built by Ray Nurse, and um, I've always loved his instruments, and so when this one became available, I thought, okay, yeah, I got to get that. Now it's this instrument is based on an instrument by Hans Frey. Hans Frey was a great German lute maker who I think worked in Venice. And I think the instrument was made in the original instrument was made in the 1550s.
Okay.
And one of the things about great instruments of the great lutes of the Renaissance is that it's quite rare, in fact, to find an a lute from the Renaissance that has not been considerably altered. And so the original lute by Hans Frey is in the Warwick Museum in England, and it was changed considerably over its lifetime of being an instrument that people played. So it's now elaborately inlaid on the fingerboard. It has more strings than it would originally have had. It's got, a few other bells and whistles attached, but the body looks just like this. We got the right number of ribs in the right kind of pretty maple that I could just look at all day long. But as what we would call a 7-course Renaissance lute, this is configured to be roughly the kind of instrument that, let's say John Dowland would have had. Now, what is a course? A course is a lute string. They might be double or they might be single. And if I get up close to the camera, maybe your viewers can see that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The tuning of the instrument is roughly similar to a guitar. It's tuned in fourths with a third stuck in there to balance it out, and an extra string. But it's played in much the same way as a guitar, but with more tuning. And throughout the 16th century, the lute was a 6-course instrument, and towards the end of the 16th century, a lower 7th course was added. So this is, let's say an instrument for the 1570s, 1580s kind of time.
Right.
And now that I see it on camera, it could use a bit of cleaning.
Wasn't quite ready for its close up.
Yeah. Which we do periodically. There are ways, the responsible ways of cleaning off the top of your lute, but I guess I have been playing it a fair amount lately. Now, what I thought I would play for you was a little bit of the second piece on the program, which is the Fantasia of Francesco da Milano, in part because I think of all of the pieces, it is the one that provides the clearest illustration of the very basics of what comprises a fantasy.
Oh, okay. Wonderful.
Now, what you'll hear at the beginning is the various voices of the choir entering. So when we talk about imitative counterpoint, which is a term that I use way more often than I ought to, what this means is that I'll be playing music that has more than one voice sounding simultaneously, and those voices will be imitating each other. So first you'll hear the bass play this point, this little tune. While it's doing that, you'll hear the tenor or the alto or somebody going. And then the sopranos come in going. And then throughout the piece, it's not always that same little tune. Sometimes it'll be just. there'll be just something that's being imitated between the voices. And yeah, so I'll just play a bit of this for you and let you
Yeah,
guys see.
go ahead, take it away, please.
Well, first I need to knock the cobwebs off a little bit. I'll give you some kind of sign that I'm starting the actual number.
Okay. Okay. Oh, John, thank you. That was lovely.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Really beautiful. Well, I think maybe it would be a good time to take a little pause here and maybe see if the audience has some questions. We've certainly covered a
Oh,
lot of ground so far. So I'm just going to take a look and see what we
okay.
have. So RJ asks, how do you characterize the differences between lute composers of different nationalities, such as Dallin versus J.S. Bach and Sibelius Leopold Weiss versus Italian composers?
Oh, well, it's, I mean, oftentimes we can, in music, we often find well, stereotypes can really be quite useful in talking about music. I think they're dreadful things to talk about, actual people with. But in music, there are certain things that we find uh, characterize, a given national lute school, right? Now, when I now the comparisons that RJ referred to have the added difficulty of crossing centuries, great big huge stylistic divides. Now, in the case of J.S. Bach and John Dowland, was that one of the ones he asked?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah. So
Yes.
J.S. Bach and John Dowland, in certain crucial ways, I find those two composers to have a great deal in common.
Mhm.
Um, in that they both wrote music that is nearly impossible to play well. They both wrote music of incredible emotional density.
Mhm.
Um, but and like in their treatment of dances, there's something kind of similar as well. Um, that J.S. Bach, when he's writing a jig, it is not just a jig. In kind of the same way that um, when Dowland wrote a Galliard, it wasn't just a hippy dippy hoppy, you know, Galliard. So their treatment of the dance in that way, it's kind of similar. Um, as far as the use of the instrument, they wrote for quite different instruments. The
Mhm.
Renaissance lute and the Baroque lute are tuned entirely differently. In the case of the music of Bach, it's not entirely clear whether he was fully cognizant of how the instrument was played. His the keyboard music of Bach is very much keyboard music in its conception.
Mhm.
It is playable on a lute by a sufficiently skilled player, but it is not idiomatic to the instrument. Whereas in the case of John Dowland, his music is very, very difficult, of course, but it is idiomatic to the instrument itself. Um, and the other differences between the two of them are due to their being 150 years apart stylistically. Um,
Right.
whether uh, Bach's assimilation of the Italianate style of Vivaldi and the French style of Lully uh, would make him, more stylistically rich than Dowland. I can't really say. Some of Dowland's music is Italianate in character.
Mhm.
Um, like his some of his fantasies behave very much like fantasies by Italian or Dutch composers of the time. But um, so they were both also musical pack rats. I'd say that as composers, they had a lot in common, but their music has very little in common.
Okay.
So,
Got you.
and then with Silvius Weiss, compared to the composers of the Italian school, by the time Weiss was writing for the lute, there were very few Italians who were writing any lute music, but the little bit of Italian lute music there is from the 18th century tends to be much lighter in character than the music of Silvius Weiss. Weiss's music is like big, serious Bachian Baroque music with
Mhm.
with some gallant leanings. And I'm saying this as a person who does not specialize in that music at all. Um,
Right.
but the music of the Italian composers of the time tends to be pretty lightweight. It can be quite lovely. It can be quite lovely. It can be just fantastic to listen to, but it's much more lightweight by comparison.
Got you.
Yeah.
So, Joel also has a question for you.
Right.
What do you know about the lute that Martin Luther played and used to compose his hymns?
Um, I don't necessarily know anything about that lute in particular, except that it was almost definitely a six-course lute. The lute that would have been popular around then was, it wouldn't have been necessarily all that different from this one. Just
Mhm.
lose a string, lose my low D string. Martin Luther would have almost certainly played on a six-course Renaissance lute. Um, and it would be, so yeah, it would be maybe a little smaller, a little fatter than this guy.
Mhm.
Um, there were certain other elements of lute construction that adapted and changed in subtle ways over the course of the Renaissance, but it would have looked from a distance just like this.
So we have another person who's wondering, what is it like to play lute in St. James Cathedral?
It is fantastic. Everybody should do it. Get a lute, go to St. James. When it's safe to do that. It's I spend a lot of my practice time is in the room where I'm broadcasting from right now, which is a basement room in our half of this duplex, and I've acoustically killed it in order to be able to do some recording and things like that. So I'm spending a lot of time playing an acoustic that is as dead as I can make it in my home, and when I was a music student in college, there were the times that you would practice in a practice room, because practice rooms tend to have acoustic tiles on the walls, and they try to make them as dead as possible, because when you're in an acoustically dead space, you hear every stupid thing you're doing, and every little slip of the finger, and every little buzzed string, and every little click and wheeze, and So when you needed an ego boost, you'd go to the stairwell and play in the stairwell for a while. This was great. And the girls would stop and listen. And also you sounded fantastic in there because it was a big resonant place, and you couldn't hear any of the stupid stuff you were doing. So, like it kind of smoothed out a lot of your little imperfections. And St. James has, I don't know what, half an hour of reverb. You play a note. No, I exaggerate, but like I think it's 6 to 8 seconds or something like that. And so it naturally just feels beautiful. Now, playing Renaissance music, one of the things that you always think about is, okay, where was this music heard? What kind of acoustics were people thinking of when they do this? Anytime you listen to music, you can kind of think in the same way that, the people that are making popular music these days, they're making music that is optimized for you to hear it through headphones.
Right.
Or for you to hear it through a teeny little computer speaker, like the music. And I think that there's never been a time that composers didn't do that they didn't kind of compose for their ideal acoustic or medium or something like that. And there's something about playing Renaissance polyphony in a big resonant church that just makes sense. It just makes sense. So it's a lovely place to play the lute. Now, I think if I were to actually play a recital in there, it would be highly challenging for anybody who was seated more than about 12 feet away. But it's still a great.
Oh, you're freezing for some reason. You might come back here. Oh.
Am I here?
Oh, there you are. Now you're back.
Okay.
Yep, you're back. So, so we have another question that came in. I enjoyed you in the concerto for electric theorbo. What do you think about contemporary music for early instruments?
I think that people that want to play it should. I personally, I really enjoyed working with Aaron. I think he's a wonderful composer, and I think he does great work, and I hope he does a lot more. And I loved Strange Seasons. It's a beautiful piece, and it was incredibly. I don't think I've ever had such a fuss made over me as I did when I was learning that piece and got to play it. It was you
were a rock star
moment of my career. But there is a reason that I became a professional lute player. And it is not because I'm incredibly interested in the music of my own time. I spent quite a lot of time as a guitarist playing modern music, and I still wind up playing some modern music in my life, but it's not necessarily something that I find generally that satisfying. Something special like a concerto for electric theorbo written by Aaron Grad. That's an exception that I happily made. But overall, it's again, I think anybody who wants to should do it. I have quite a lot of friends that do vast amounts of contemporary music. It's a it's a it's a great thing to do, but it's not necessarily what I feel called to do personally. Like, hire me, pay me money to do it, but I won't necessarily be the one filling out the grant applications and contacting the composers.
Yeah, I think we've had a pretty good idea tonight of where your heart is. It's a love affair with a particular type of music for sure.
Yes.
So Zoe asks, as a vol player who learned tablature over the pandemic, I'm curious about what lute repertoire is typically originally in tablature. Farabosco, Dowland. So
All
that's
of it. All lute music is written in tablature. There's a small amount of lute music from the 18th century that was written in staff notation, but all uh, all the lute music you could ever want to learn is in tablature. Hi Zoe, um, I'm pretty sure I know who that is. Um, uh, the uh, the difficulty is then finding that there is some lute music that is in other tablatures. We've got our big three: um, French tablature, which is the one that viol players tend to learn also, and then Italian tablature, which has numbers and is upside down with respect to French tablature, and then there's German tablature, which has a different symbol for each fret of each string. Um, but yeah, but all the lute music, every single last note of Dowland is available in tablature. There are also staff notation arrangements of a lot of the music of great composers, but all the lute music.
So we have one question left, and it's in good timing here. So, are you interested in the Baroque lute in D minor? Do you perform on it?
I'm interested in it, and I have a beautiful Baroque lute in D minor, and the music of, I mean, the music of Johann Sebastian Bach is as dear to my heart as anything else that I could ever play. And the music of Sylvius Leopold Weiss is absolutely wonderful. And then, the other side of French Baroque lute music uh, is such an incredibly rich repertory, and it's a wonderful ocean of music. Um, the difficulty is finding the time, and yeah, I have performed on the Baroque lute. I've performed a few times on it, but and I hope that I will in the future. Right now I'm binging on Renaissance lute, and it feels like coming home. The Baroque lute is an instrument. It takes me a lot of work to get it up and running.
Okay.
The you know I guess the thing is, having been a guitarist and a banjo player and a lute player and a theorbo player and a Baroque guitarist, all of those instruments are more or less transpositions of each other. The tunings of each of those instruments kind of lends itself to thinking in the tuning of the next one down the line. And then, for me at least, when I go to play the Baroque lute, everything is brand new. Now I can sort of, like, I've worked around it, I figured it out, but still, I don't sort of immediately leap intuitively to the right notes, which is it's a puzzling feeling when you've been playing music for as long as I have, for something that looks just like the thing you usually do. It's strings and frets, but they don't behave the way you're accustomed to. So yes, but I do love the Baroque lute, and I and I hope to play more of it in the future.
Okay. Well, I think we are just about out of time now. So I just want to thank you, John, so much for taking time to visit with all of us tonight. And
You're welcome.
everyone who's been joining us, please be sure to catch John's concert on Sunday, Valentine's Day at 2 o'clock, and it will be on our website. And it's been wonderful spending the evening with you, John, and with everyone who's joined us. And I just want to thank you all, and everyone have a lovely night. And until next time, take care, and we'll see you
Thank,
again.
thanks so
Bye
much,
bye.
Betsy. Thanks,
You're
guys. See y'all.
welcome. Bye.
Bye bye.